Hello, and welcome to our presentation and discussion on active learning and student engagement in creative media education. For those who don't know us, SAE Institute is a creative media college focusing on the disciplines of games development, film, audio, music, design, and animation. So I'd like to introduce who will be speaking to you today. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Colin Webber. He's the Dean of SAE Australia. As Dean, Colin is head of the academics for SAE Institute. Second, Jeffrey Hill, that's me. I'm the Games Course Committee Chair and Department Coordinator on the Melbourne campus. I'm responsible for the team that develops the Games program for SAE and the application of that on the Melbourne campus. For today's session, we're going to have a quick look at the SAE Institute Game Development Program structure. Colin will be speaking about active learning. Then we'll be talking about the application of those into a program with active learning in project and problem-based structures. We should have some time for some questions at the end. So as a little background, SAE has a number of games programs and nested exit awards, those being a diploma of game development, an associate degree of game development, and a Bachelor of Games Development in Games Design and in Games Programming. At a full-time study load, our first 2 trimesters of or as we call it, our first stage, represent the Diploma of Game Development. These modules cover foundational technical knowledge and skills for games development. They utilize project-based learning where they're applying technical and process skills that they're learning into a project, scaffolded by active learning activities in the classroom. The second 2 trimesters, or our stage 2, the students are undertaking project-based learning in the studios, where they're applying that technical, process, and professional knowledge into a project with a driving question. So, for example, in a studio, they might be developing a game with meaning, inquiry, or purpose. Or maybe they're creating a networking-based multiplayer game. They're given a driving question and apply that through a project structure. The final stage sees the students undertaking their major project across 2 trimesters. This is an interdisciplinary games project with their own creative control. They're utilizing what they've learned from a technical process and a professional knowledge into this large project that they present. So as students progress through the program, we're engaging with them at an increasing level and expectation of their application of their technical, their personal, and their professional application. I'd now like to hand over to Colin to talk about active learning.
Thanks, Geoff. So I wanted us to have a look at our pedagogical approach and why we think it's different to the way that a lot of other academic institutions are working. And I'm not just talking about IT or games or creative industries, but this is our approach that we take to everything that we do at SAE. We have a couple of what educational buzz terms, I guess, that you'll hear us use, but I want to put the context of how we use those. The first of those is active learning, and then we will talk about how that fits into project-based learning. And also we use a form of holistic assessment to ensure that our students are understanding everything that we're doing. So active learning basically is based on the idea that if a student finds something themselves and finds the means to understand that themselves, they'll retain it rather than something being given to them. So rather than a didactic approach where we say information exchange, we say this is X is X, X is true, remember it, learn how to apply it, to have an explanation of what is X and how does it resolve. So if we think about how we would design a lesson in an active learning space, we look at instead of how much can I tell the student to how little can I tell the student and have them knowing the same amount at the end. So our processes are inquiry-based. We set up discussion points. We set up a lot of group work where groups are interrogating each other. uncovering part of solutions themselves, sharing that with others so that you end up with the whole picture, that everyone's collaborating. Look, there is still a place for presentation of knowledge as well. You can still have those occasions where there's nothing better than a 5-minute PowerPoint, but 1-hour lecture is not what we do at SAE. Most of what we do is in groups, but we still expect our students to engage individually with their own learning, and specifically to be able to reflect upon their own learning and direct their own learning. So the concept of deliberate practice is quite strong in what we do. We ask our students to reflect on what they did, the implications, so what, about what they did, and the next stages, the now what, as part of their learning process. And deliberate practice means that we expect students to have an understanding of what they're good at and what they're not so good at, and to deliberately practice the things that they're not good at and to develop themselves. So these active learning processes are particularly the chunks of learning that you would associate with those fundamental processes, especially in the stage 1 that Geoff described, where we have a need to get our students up to a certain level to be able to do projects, because we operate also on the concept of everything is just in time. So rather than giving students a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, just in case they're going to use it next week, we give them what we know they're going to use next week. And we set up processes so they're learning, applying, learning, applying, learning, applying. Everything is in these small chunks and iterated so that they have the opportunity to apply things badly and then understand from that and then come back and do that process again. So for example, we don't have assessments, we have projects. Our students work together on these projects to the point that they reach the specification of that project. And in fact, if they don't reach the specification, we don't expect the student to go back and make it reach the specification. The feedback we're providing in that iterative process is to be applied to the next project. So there's always a moving forward. So it's quite different to the idea of trying to replicate a workplace, in that we have an expectation that students will fail and learn from that fail. And that's particularly in the first 2 stages of what they do. So if we take the idea of active learning as being the micro element of the learning process, project-based learning is the next level up. So Geoff referred to the creation of a driving question that a student can create with their facilitator a project to address. Now, often these driving questions are designed to be sociological, have social impact. So while we might be creating a level-based game, we might be asking the students to address a social problem, such as awareness of climate change. So how can we, as a group of students creating a game, draw attention to, with the audience that we're working for, maybe it's a level game for 5 to 8 year olds. So how can we address the issue of climate change in 5 to 8 year olds through the creation of a level-based game? And then what skills do we need to learn at each point through active learning to get there? So our projects in our first stage tend to be predefined by our course committees, so that the constructive alignment is very, very clear. When we get to the stage 2, we actually hand over some of the responsibility for constructive alignment to our students. And in fact, in recent audits, we've had external people commenting to us that we're unusual in that our students actually understand learning outcomes. They understand how those learning outcomes are implemented within the projects they do and how they affect their final program outcomes. So that's something which seems to be fairly unique to us. I think it's worth mentioning too that our form of project-based learning is collaborative. We expect students to learn from each other, teach each other, be working in interdisciplinary teams, we're at the point now that because we have 6 campuses, we have an expectation that students will engage in projects at least once within their academic career with a project on another campus. And we have expectations that students are working with students from other disciplines as well. But that project-based learning is also where we really emphasize this idea of active and just-in-time project. These come from a sort of long line of antecedents, if you like: inquiry-based learning, project-oriented learning, and project-based. So project-oriented is sometimes what I remember seeing my kids do in primary school, where they go and learn about a whole lot of stuff. They might do excursions, and then they come back and they do a project about what they've learned. Whereas project-based learning takes it the other way. We start on the project, and then we find the things that we're going to need to learn along the way. And in terms of programming, or in terms of the games design and so forth, our facilitators know what they're going to come up against, because the facilitators are experienced in that level of design. So we can plan that process. So they're the basis of our programs. The students are engaged, getting their hands dirty, I guess, right from the very start. And we gradually give the student more autonomy in that design process. So by the time they get to stage 3, the students are defining their own driving questions. They're defining their own set of constraints. They're defining what they might need to learn in order to continue. And our process is more supervisory in that and building on the rigor for that. I think a point that's important to stress right through here is that there are certain skills that we know employers need. And they're not necessarily just the technical skills in the design or the programming process. Graduates need to be able to operate in a marketplace, a jobs marketplace that is constantly changing, technologically, sociologically, the way that we go about things. And one of my favorite studies around this doesn't come from games, it comes from audio, but a large Delphi study conducted in around about 2010, looking at the type of skills and competencies that were needed, expected of graduates from audio programs looking forward. At the end of that study, the compiled list of about 160 competencies, the top 20, only one of them actually mentioned audio in any way. They were all about transferable skills, the ability to adapt, to learn, to communicate, to understand their own learning. So a lot of our processes are about developing that lifelong learning, but also the ability to work within the marketplace. So for example, within our structures, in our capstone, we have a default elective placed in there, which is about entrepreneurship and business. But these elements are embedded right through the program. We have a requirement from a regulator to embed employability skills at every AQF level. And because our programs are nested, diploma at AQF 5, associate degree at 6, and the bachelor's degree at 7, we embed those employability skills, including aspects like marketability, understanding audience, understanding copyright and intellectual property. Those elements are embedded. So when we create a design for a game or for an album or for a film, understanding that audience and how we reach that audience and how we deal with possible income from that audience as part of our processes. So I'll get more detail about how that applies to games itself. Back to Geoff.
Thank you, Colin. So how does that look in a program? Well, I think we need to examine how active learning is embedded at the 2 key stages of our program. As students enter the games program, they're very commonly right out of high school, or maybe they've taken some time away from study, a few years maybe. The students commonly have a superficial understanding of the software development and the collaborative processes of making games. You get a lot of, I can play games, so I'm sure I can make them. How hard can it be? So in the first stage, we're revealing a lot of new domains of knowledge, but we have very limited time with the students. They're in the classroom around 12 hours per week to cover 4 subjects worth of knowledge and application. So at stage 1, we're very focused on engaging with a before class, an in-class, and an after-class structure to optimize learning in each of these modes. So in the before class, we're optimizing for that mode that it's best at. That's usually things like communication of facts and knowledge. So they might be watching a video on a topic or doing a reading, or might be following a specific technical tutorial, a set of steps. Once they've done that, and once they've learned that core knowledge, it comes to the applying that knowledge in the classroom. And this is where active learning really kicks in. In active learning activities, they might be applying knowledge in a new or unknown way, or they might be breaking its assumptions and revealing a set of underlying rules through an activity with their peer. The key here is that these active learning activities are actively engaging the students with their knowledge that they've learnt. They're taking advantage of that active component to embed that knowledge and their understanding of it. It's kind of that old, when you break a thing, take it apart and have to put it back together, is when you get a really good understanding of how something works. We're doing that exact kind of process in the classroom through active learning activities, where they're breaking these things apart. They're looking at the application of that knowledge. After class, we look at reflection, or we focus on reflection at the topic, the process themselves, and contextualizing what they've been learning as a student and what they've learned, and their place in the industry. And then in stage 2, so this is where they've started their 3rd trimester and on. They've gotten used to those learning processes, so they're working on larger projects, larger collaborative projects. So we follow a similar structure here, but it's a slightly more open process. Because these students are building these projects with a driving question and a set of constraints, such as a technical dimension, they use the active learning activities in the classroom to reinforce that knowledge. So they've got a project and they may go down a particular path for solving the problem for that project, one that's different to other teams. So what they might be doing, for example, is then presenting that knowledge to their peers in a learning activity, or developing a tutorial for their peers to follow. They're participants in their learning. They're responsible for it. And that reinforces and embeds that useful and important skill of that lifetime learning and solving unknown problems. So thank you very much for joining us for this brief discussion on active learning in our games program. I'd like to open it up to any questions now if anyone has any.